Imagine the Wild West of Hollywood, rugged cowboys with perfect teeth, spotless dusters, and that heroic shine of adventure in their eyes. Now, let me tell you why that's complete nonsense. The real Wild West wasn't just wild, it was filthy, putrid, and downright revolting. What you're about to learn will forever change how you see those legendary gunslingers and frontier towns. Instead of the clean-cut heroes you've seen in movies, picture men who hadn't bathed in months, their clothes stiff with sweat and grime, teeth rotting in their skulls. When people say the West was wild, they aren't just talking about the lawlessness, they're talking about the overwhelming stench of human existence without modern sanitation. Today, we're diving into the stomach-turning reality of frontier hygiene, where soap was a luxury, bathing was rare, and the smell, well, let's just say there's a reason they called it the Wild West. Daily life and personal hygiene. The daily reality of personal hygiene in the Wild West would make your skin crawl. Quite literally. Bathing was a luxury most people indulged in just a few times a year, typically during the warmer months. The famous Saturday night bath, that tradition didn't emerge until the late 1800s, and even then, an entire family would share the same bathwater, starting with Pa and ending with the baby. By the end, the water was so filthy you could lose a kid in it. Soap, when available, was a crude affair made from animal fat and lye. Most folks relied on alternatives like sand, corn cobs, or plain water to scrub themselves. Some creative cowboys would roll in sage after a long ride, claiming it masked the body odor. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Hair care was equally primitive. Both men and women would go months without washing their hair, leading to what they called colony, a delicate term for lice infestation. To combat the grease, people would run bacon fat through their hair, believing it would keep it shiny and manageable. Instead, it attracted flies and made the smell even worse. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was dental hygiene. Forget minty fresh breath. Most settlers had never seen a toothbrush. The lucky ones might have a twig with frayed ends to scrub their teeth, but most relied on whatever was handy: tobacco juice, charcoal, or just swishing water around their mouths. By age 30, many frontiersmen had lost most of their teeth to decay and infection. Dentists, when you could find one, were more likely to pull teeth than save them, often using crude tools that would make modern dentists faint. The result? A population with breath so bad it could knock a buzzard off a gut wagon. Some accounts from the time describe the smell of a man's breath as being worse than the stench of his unwashed body. And that's really saying something. Women weren't much better off, though they typically tried harder to maintain some semblance of cleanliness, often using herbs like mint or sage to mask their breath. Clothing and laundry. If you think wearing the same outfit twice without washing is bad, imagine wearing the same clothes for 6 months straight. In the Wild West, most people owned exactly 2 sets of clothing, one for daily wear and one for special occasions, if they were lucky. That daily wear outfit? It became a second skin, accumulating layers of sweat, dirt, and things we'd rather not mention. Washing clothes was a backbreaking task that few had the luxury of performing regularly. When they did wash, it was an all-day affair. Women would boil water in large kettles, using homemade lye soap that was harsh enough to burn skin. The clothes would be stirred with a stick. No one dared put their hands in that scalding, caustic mixture. The result? Clothes so stiff they could stand up on their own when dried. But here's the truly skin-crawling part. Those clothes were perfect breeding grounds for parasites. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs weren't just occasional visitors, they were permanent residents. Cowboys would often strip down and hang their clothes over a campfire, hoping the smoke would drive out the critters. Some would even spread their clothes on an ant hill, letting the formic acid from the ants kill the parasites. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The leather clothing that's so iconic of the Old West, it served a practical purpose beyond style. Leather was more durable and water-resistant than cloth, and most importantly, it was easier to clean. You could simply scrape off the worst of the dirt. But imagine wearing those heavy leather chaps in the scorching western sun, your body cooking in its own sweat. That distinctive cowboy bow-legged walk, it wasn't just from riding horses, it was also from the chafing. Even the wealthy, with their fine Eastern clothes, couldn't escape the reality of frontier life. Those fancy dresses and suits would quickly become just as filthy as everyone else's clothing. The West was a great equalizer when it came to dirt. Living conditions. The living conditions in the Wild West would make your average gas station bathroom look like a 5-star hotel. Let's start with housing. Whether you lived in a soft sod house, log cabin, or traditional frontier home, you were sharing your space with a variety of unwanted roommates. Rats, mice, bedbugs, and cockroaches weren't pests, they were neighbors. Waste disposal? That's a polite term for what was essentially a free-for-all. Most homes had an outhouse if they were fancy. Otherwise, it was a short walk into the bushes. These outdoor toilets were usually placed without much thought to water sources, leading to contaminated wells and streams. And during winter, let's just say people got creative with chamber pots, and the phrase, "don't eat the yellow snow," gained a whole new meaning. Water was a precious commodity, but not necessarily a clean one. Most frontier families drew their water from rivers, streams, or shallow wells. The same water source might be used for drinking, washing, and watering livestock, upstream for drinking, downstream for everything else, if you were smart. But here's the kicker. Nobody understood germ theory yet. The same river where you got your drinking water might have a decomposing buffalo upstream, or worse. The proximity to animals added another layer to the hygiene horror show. Most homesteaders lived close to their livestock, really close. Chickens might roost right outside your window, pigs would wallow near the house, and horses and cattle were kept as close as possible to prevent theft. All these animals contributed their own special additions to the frontier bouquet. During winter, some folks even brought their animals inside for warmth, sharing their living space with chickens, pigs, or even cows. The result was a perfect storm of smells, parasites, and diseases. The term "living in filth" wasn't an insult. It was just a statement of fact. Even the most fastidious housewife couldn't keep the dirt and mess at bay entirely. Town life versus trail life. If you thought frontier towns were a step up from trail life, think again. Sure, towns offered some amenities, but they were far from what we'd consider civilized today. Public bathhouses did exist in larger settlements, but they were often breeding grounds for disease. Picture this: dozens of people sharing the same bathwater, each adding their own special blend of trail grime to the mix. By the end of the day, that water was thick enough to plow. Trail life was even more primitive. Cowboys on cattle drives could go months without a proper wash. Their solution? They'd ride through rivers fully clothed, calling it a bath. Some would strip down and drag their clothes behind their horse on a rope, a frontier washing machine, if you will. The reality was, on the trail, hygiene took a backseat to survival. The emergence of cleaning parlors in frontier towns tells its own story. These weren't just places to get clean, they were social institutions. For a few cents, you could get a bath, a shave, and maybe even a tooth pulling if you were brave enough. But here's the catch. These parlors often doubled as brothels, adding another layer of complexity to frontier hygiene. The saying, "getting cleaned up," took on a whole new meaning. The contrast between town and trail hygiene created some interesting social dynamics. When trail hands came to town, locals could smell them coming. Some establishments even had special trail hand entrances to keep the more pungent customers separate from the clean folks. Hotels would charge extra for cowboys, knowing they'd have to burn the bedding afterward. But perhaps the most telling detail was the development of clean zones in frontier towns. These were areas where basic hygiene standards were enforced, usually around the fancier establishments. Break these rules, and you might find yourself getting an involuntary bath in the horse trough, courtesy of the local committee for public cleanliness. Health consequences. Let's talk about what happens when you combine terrible hygiene with non-existent medical knowledge. The results were about as pretty as a rattlesnake in a flower garden. Disease wasn't just common in the Wild West, it was a way of life. The average life expectancy hovered around 45 years, and poor hygiene was a major culprit. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were such frequent visitors they might as well have had reserved seats at the dinner table. These waterborne diseases spread like wildfire through communities, thanks to contaminated water sources and non-existent sewage systems. One person's private business upstream could spell disaster for an entire town downstream. The medical treatments? They were often worse than the diseases themselves. Frontier doctors, if you could find one, might prescribe mercury for everything from toothaches to typhoid. Their surgical tools were rarely cleaned between patients, if they were cleaned at all. Many carried their instruments in the same leather bag they used for their lunch. Imagine getting your leg amputated with a saw that still had traces of the last patient's gangrene. Speaking of skin conditions, let's talk about the lovely world of parasitic infections. Body lice were so common that people developed a peculiar gait from constant scratching. Scabies, ringworm, and fungal infections flourished in the warm, moist environment of unwashed bodies and clothes. The term cooties actually originated from this era. It comes from the Spanish word cucaracha, referring to the lice that were every frontier child's constant companions. But perhaps the most insidious health consequence was the spread of tuberculosis, or consumption, as they called it. The disease spread rapidly in the close, unventilated quarters of frontier homes, especially during winter when families huddled together for warmth. The romantic image of the pale, consumptive beauty? That was just a slow death dressed up in poetry. Social impact. In the Wild West, you could tell a person's social status by their smell, or rather, how much they could afford to not smell. Class distinctions were drawn along soap lines, quite literally. The wealthy might own imported perfumes and fancy soaps, while the poor made do with whatever they could scrounge up. But here's the irony. Even the richest frontier folk would be considered shockingly dirty by today's standards. Gender played a huge role in hygiene expectations. Women were expected to maintain some semblance of cleanliness, even in impossible conditions. They'd use harsh lye soaps that burned their hands raw, all to keep up appearances. Men, on the other hand, wore their filth like a badge of honor. The dirtier you were, the harder you must have been working, or so the thinking went. Some men even believed that bathing too often would weaken them, making them susceptible to illness. Native American hygiene practices often put settlers to shame. Many tribes had sophisticated cleansing rituals, including sweat lodges and regular bathing. They used native plants for soap and dental care, and their clothes were regularly cleaned and smoked to kill parasites. Settlers often mocked these practices as savage customs, while literally rotting in their own filth. The irony was completely lost on them. Then there was the infamous frontier smell, a unique bouquet that combined unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, stale tobacco, and countless other aromatic elements. It was so distinctive that Native Americans could literally smell settlers coming from miles away. This smell became a sort of cultural identifier. If you didn't stink like a settler, you weren't really Western enough. Social gatherings were particularly interesting. Dances and social events would bring together crowds of unwashed people in close quarters. The heat and exertion would create what one diary described as a fog of human vapors thick enough to cut with a knife. The gradual change. The arrival of the railroad didn't just bring people and supplies to the frontier, it brought the first whiffs of modern hygiene. By the 1880s, mail-order catalogs were offering newfangled inventions like indoor plumbing fixtures and fancy store-bought soaps. The Wild West was finally getting a much-needed bath, whether it wanted one or not. The transformation wasn't overnight. Those mail-order toilets weren't worth much without proper sewage systems, and many frontier folks viewed new hygiene products with suspicion. Some old-timers claimed that store-bought soap would weaken the constitution, and that indoor plumbing was an invitation to disease. They'd survived this long being filthy. Why change now? But change was inevitable. Women's magazines began spreading East Coast hygiene standards westward. Articles about proper cleanliness and modern sanitation became popular reading material. Public health awareness grew as doctors started connecting disease outbreaks to poor hygiene. Towns began implementing basic sanitation laws, though enforcing them was another matter entirely. The most dramatic shift came with the younger generation. Children who grew up with access to store-bought soap and the occasional indoor toilet weren't keen on reverting to the old ways. Schools began teaching basic hygiene, though some parents grumbled about this fancy Eastern education. By the turn of the century, regular bathing was no longer seen as a suspicious Eastern habit, but as a mark of civilization. Perhaps the greatest testament to this change was the evolution of the iconic American bathroom. Those mail-order catalogs that once seemed so foreign became wish books for frontier families. Indoor plumbing, while still a luxury, was no longer viewed as witchcraft. The Saturday night bath transformed from a dreaded chore into a symbol of progress. But let's be honest, the next time you watch a Western, remember that those dashing cowboys and lovely ladies would have smelled worse than a skunk's wedding in a garbage dump. Sometimes, progress smells like roses, or at least like store-bought soap.